want to know how bright your scene is when you're looking through your camera, how do you do it? So you could guess, but your camera already has a feature in it that tells you exactly how bright your scene is, and you have to know how to read it and how to use it. That's what we're going to talk about today. What's up? It's your boy, the Mackie Mouse, and welcome to Mackie Mouse Media. In this series, Just Go Shoot Manual, where we conquer manual photography on your camera. If you don't want to miss the rest of the series, consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing that bell so you don't miss any of the videos. Last time we talked about the settings of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and how those three settings together make exposure and the exposure triangle. So how do you know when the exposure is just right? You could guess, you could just look at your screen and go, I think that's bright enough, but there's a lot of factors that can be involved there. Are you outside or inside? What's the brightness level of your LCD? If you're using a DSLR and you're looking through that viewfinder, you're just looking through mirrors, so you can't see how bright or dark your settings are at all. So what is the way that you can know for sure that your exposure is dead on? Enter today's subject of camera metering. So your camera has a feature called an exposure meter, where it actually measures the amount of light that is being reflected off the scene and coming through the lens. Side note, if you see the term TTL in any time that you're reading or on websites or anything, that's what that term means, through the lens. And it just means something that's not ambient. It's actually something that your camera's reading literally through the lens. So what you're looking for is something that kind of looks like a ruler. There will be a mark in the center marked 0, and that is optimal exposure. That's pretty much what you're shooting for. That's your kind of reference point. On one side of that 0 will be some positive marks. On the other side will be some negative marks. Obviously on the positive side, that is brighter than optimal exposure, and on the negative side, that is darker than optimal exposure. Once you hit the shutter button halfway in preparation to take a picture, it'll put a little tick mark somewhere on this ruler to let you know quite literally how this scene measures up in terms of how much light is in it. So that information will let you know kind of how to change the exposure to make it brighter or darker, to make sure that your exposure is dead on every single time. There are a few different places where you'll find this meter, but more or less, it's going to be in the same location where your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO information is. So wherever you're going to find that information, the exposure meter is probably somewhere close to it. If you look through a viewfinder, for instance, it'll be dead center right on the bottom, there's like a little black strip on the bottom, and you'll see the meter down there. And don't forget, that meter is not going to be activated until you hit that shutter halfway. As a quick side tip, while you're searching around for where this meter is, there are some cameras that abbreviate it MM, as in multimeter instead of exposure meter, which is language from some of the old manual photography days. But that MM is the same thing as the exposure meter, and sometimes it won't give you the ruler itself. I know on the Sony A7 III, and I'm not sure, but possibly some other Sony models, instead of giving you the ruler to save space on the LCD screen, they just spit the number back out to you. So it'll say +1, +3, -0.7, whatever. So it just gives you the actual readout instead of plotting it on that ruler, but it's the same information. It's just telling you whether or not your scene is brighter or darker than what the camera thinks should be optimal exposure. Speaking of language things, before I go, I just wanted to talk about a little semantics language stuff so that if you ever encounter these terms online or in your research or anything, you kind of understand what they mean and how they are involved in this conversation that we're having. The first thing I want you to know and just have in the back of your mind is the term stops. So you'll see f-stop, or you'll just see something talking about a stop of light. So what a stop is how light is measured in the camera. So it's more or less doubling or halving the light. That's an oversimplification, but without getting too nitty-gritty into the mathematics behind it, that's pretty much what it is. So if you click your shutter speed one click faster, say you're on 200, you click it up to 250, you're pretty much doubling the amount of light that's let in. And so with that exposure triangle, like we learned about in the last video, those three settings all work together. So if you want to make something darker, you can do it by making shutter speed faster. You can do it by making the aperture slower. You can also do both and double down. You can say, make the shutter speed faster, make the aperture smaller, and make the ISO lower and less sensitive. Those three things together, every time you do it, would make it darker. So one click on the shutter, one click on the aperture, and one click on the ISO, that's 3 clicks. So that's 3 stops darker than when you started. That's pretty much how stops work. So if you ever see that in reading, just know that you're talking about making it brighter or darker, because even when we're talking about metering, each one of those little tick marks is actually 1/3 of a stop. Now, don't get afraid that you're gonna have to do some kind of math on the fly when you're out in the field. The mathematics don't matter. All you need to know is that you're going 1 stop down, 2 stops down, or 1 stop up. That's all you need to know. You don't have to know the exact number. And when the little markers on the ruler are saying -1, that's saying that's 1 full stop darker, or 1 full stop brighter, or 2 full stops brighter, etc. The other thing I want you to know is the term EV, which is just an abbreviation for exposure value. So the exposure meter in your camera, the number that it gives you, or the little place that the ticker is placed on the ruler, is the exposure value. That's just the number that it gives you back when you do the evaluation. So an exposure value of -6 is 6 stops darker than optimal exposure. So that number, negative or plus, whatever the number is just telling you how far away from optimal exposure you are. In a previous video, I reviewed the Canon EOS R, which is Canon's first full-frame mirrorless camera that I will drop in this little thing up here. I don't know what this is. A container? Whatever. I'll throw that video up here if you're interested in seeing what my review is on it. But in that review, I talk about one of the features of the camera, which is some low light performance, and that it could perform in low light conditions of EV -6. So what that means is exposure value of -6 stops under optimal exposure. So that's kind of, if you ever see EV anywhere in an article or anything like that, that exposure value is just talking about how much brighter or darker from optimal exposure this particular spec is. Something I want you to keep in mind while you're messing around with this meter is something that I had a problem with when I first started photography. You're probably going to get really obsessive about making sure that ticker hits dead center 0. This meter is just a guide. That is the most important thing you can get from this video. The meter is just a measurement, but then you can decide whether you want this particular image to be maybe a little bit on the darker side or maybe a little on the lighter side. It depends on what you're shooting. Your camera has no idea what your creative vision for this photo is. All it's doing is mathematically telling you, pixel by pixel, here's how the average brightness looks in this image. And then you, as the photographer, use that information to make a judgment on whether or not it should be optimal exposure of 0, or maybe it should be a little brighter or darker. So do not get obsessed with making sure that it equals 0. It doesn't have to be exact. It's just another tool in your toolbox to make sure that the picture is exactly what you want it to look like, not necessarily what the camera thinks it should be. So now you know how to read the measurement of light that the camera makes when you point it at a scene and you hold that shutter halfway and it makes that calculation on the ruler. But how does your camera make that calculation? How does it know what part of the frame to use to give you the information of how light or dark it is? Are we talking about the entire image's brightness, or are we talking about just that lamp right there and how bright or dark that is? So that's actually something you can tell your camera how to do, and it's called metering modes. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next video, what they are and how to use them so that you can actually customize and control that meter to fit the exact needs of the image you're trying to capture. Now that you are one step further on your journey to mastering manual photography, we're going to wrap this video up right now. If you enjoyed what you saw, hit that like button, go ahead and smash that subscribe button, ring that bell so that you get notifications every single time I put a video out so you don't miss out on any of the series. Just go shoot manual. Thank you again for coming to my channel. If you're interested in supporting this channel, there's a bunch of affiliate links in the description down below. There's some of my recommendations for gear, some stuff I use, so if you're interested, go ahead and visit those links as well. And until next time, just go shoot, because the best is yet to come. Peace.